one of the first things that she would need to understand is that the offshore bond in the UK has a separate taxing regime from other aspects of taxation, such as foreign income and gains. This is the chargeable event regime, which means essentially that bonds only become liable to tax if there's a gain triggered by a chargeable event. Chargeable events are things like death, maturity, full surrender, excess partial surrenders, and assignment for money or money's worth.
From the insurance perspective, we contemplate basically two scenarios, right? So one is collective investment schemes, funds. That's widely used, no problem. We make available that solution. And then if we go more into the private banking space, of course, we avoid and we restrict any type of assets which are personalized or limited to one investor or subset of group of investors. So these assets have to be collective and widely available for anyone to invest.
Today we're discussing the case study of a French entrepreneur moving to the UK with wealth held in a Luxembourg offshore bond. We're going to get into the specifics in just a moment, but first of all, I'd like to come to my two guests for a brief introduction. Welcome to you, Stacy and Gonzalo. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you, David.
Stacy, just coming to you first, it'd be great to have a little introduction as to your practice here in London.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a partner and head of international private wealth at Burdon, London, and I advise individuals and families who are globally mobile on their tax and estate planning, so cross-border tax and estate planning.
And you have a particular expertise around these insurance products, which marks you out in this field.
Yeah, absolutely. I worked alongside Gonzalo and for several years, and so I do have a particular expertise in offshore bonds.
Wonderful. Great to have you with us. Well, Gonzalo, welcome. You've flown in from Luxembourg to come and record. This would be great to hear a little bit more about your background.
So hello, David, and a pleasure to be here with all of you. So my name is Gonzalo Garcia. I'm heading the wealth planning and product solutions team at One Life, which is an insurance carrier based in Luxembourg offering products in Europe and overseas.
Fabulous. So in this scenario, we're going to talk about the case of Sophie Laurent, who's a French entrepreneur relocating to London with 4.2 million euros in a Luxembourg offshore bond. So just starting with you, Stacey, on the UK tax framework.
Yeah.
Sophie's about to become UK tax resident for the first time, bringing her 4.2 million euro policy with her. Let's start with the basics. What are the fundamental tax principles that apply to the international offshore bonds?
Yeah, I mean, so Sophie's quite a typical arriver, high earner, coming into the UK with assets already established. One of the first things that she would need to understand is that the offshore bond in the UK has a separate taxing regime from other aspects of taxation, such as foreign income and gains. This is the chargeable event regime, which means essentially that bonds only become liable to tax if there's a gain triggered by a chargeable event. Chargeable events are things like death, maturity, full surrender, excess partial surrenders, and assignment for money or money's worth. If any of these happen, then Sophie would need to put the gain on her self-assessment tax return for that tax year. That stacks on top of her employment income in the UK. Essentially, that will be taxable to income tax and not gains. And this is one of the main differences between the UK and some of the other jurisdictions and how they tax offshore bonds, is that the UK taxes it via income tax, and it actually stacks on top of your salary. So it increases your income naturally.
Okay, thank you. And we'll get into some of the details as we move through the conversation, but an important concept here is the personal portfolio bond, the PPB. It's a bit of a tongue twister. It's a critical concept here. Can you explain why PPB rules are important and something that Sophie should really understand?
Yeah, so the personal portfolio bond rules are UK anti-avoidance rules, which are basically designed to prevent UK resident policyholders from holding personalised underlying assets in the bond, which they've got a lot of control and influence over. So essentially, HMRC has a permitted set of assets that can be held in these bonds, which are essentially, broadly speaking, pooled funds, collectives, open-ended funds. Anything outside of that permitted class if a UK resident holder has a bond that's holding anything that's personalised and outside of that, they run the risk of that bond being classified as a personal portfolio bond. The reason why we don't want that is because it comes with a very punitive annual tax.
Okay, thank you. And also the UK tax rules for non-DOMs have changed significantly very recently. Does she qualify for foreign income and gains regime? How do the new changes affect someone like Sophie thinking about moving to the UK?
I mean, she may qualify for foreign income and gains regime. It depends on if Sophie's ever been UK resident before in the sort of the last 10 tax years, essentially. If she's a new arrival, never been resident in the UK before, then she can absolutely qualify for the foreign income and gains regime, which essentially will give her the benefit of 100% tax relief on her foreign income and gains for a period of 4 tax years.
So very valuable potentially for an entrepreneur with multiple business interests outside the country.
Absolutely. Yeah. The only thing is that the offshore bond gains and the taxation of the offshore bonds do not fall under the foreign income and gains regime, which is where a lot of people get tripped up. They think, well, they can come in with the bond and then that's going to be handled the same way foreign bank interest would be, but it's not. Because again, the offshore bond under the UK rules are taxed under a specific regime, which never fell into the remittance basis regime prior to 6th of April 2025, and now does not fall into the FIG regime post 6th of April 25.
Fantastic. Gonzalo, just to bring you in, help us understand the product structure. Sophia's bond is segmented across multiple investment funds. What does segmentation, again, it's a very important word in the context of those reading around this subject. What does segmentation mean in the context of offshore bonds, and why is it relevant for UK taxation?
So segmentation is a unique concept which is not known in other European jurisdictions. It's a way to build mini policies within a big policy or master policy, and it allows UK resident policyholders to surrender individual segments, all right? And that gives you the extra flexibility of allowing not exceeding, for instance, the 5% annual threshold that is indicated by HRMC. You can as well surrender by amount of percentages, especially in offshore bonds, international offshore bonds, but it is essential to have that segmentation incorporated in the product for any type of client who is living in the UK or even planning to relocate in the future in the UK. Otherwise, it could lead to very adverse tax consequences.
So we're going to get into the details on that, but essentially it gives planning opportunities, doesn't it? The segmentation allows you flexibility to do a variety of things.
Indeed. So, and it doesn't just work for surrender purposes. You can assign segments. You can build up your product with 100 segments, 1,000 segments. So there is really a lot of flexibility and need to have segments for this type of clients.
And from One Life's perspective, as a Luxembourg carrier, what role do you play in helping clients like Sophie navigate? We've mentioned the PPB compliance, and how do you help them stay on the right side of that when they move to the UK?
Yes. So while not being the tax advisors of the clients, of course, but we always, in collaboration with lawyers, and we provide strong guidelines on what we believe are the main rules to be respected. So here we introduce, of course, the segmentation aspect. It is crucial. We introduce the notion of PPB, and we indicate clients that certain categories of assets and certain ways to handle and manage assets may lead to a risk in terms of tax requalification in the UK. And we enable that through specific documentation where we inform clients about what is the specific tax and legal framework in the UK in order to avoid any surprises when moving back, for instance.
Thank you. And Stacey, just to come to the pre-arrival planning, time apportionment, another important concept. So within the bond here, we know that Sophie has 1.7 million euros of unrealized gains that accrued while she was French tax resident. What is time apportionment relief, and how does this affect? How does this protect these from pre-UK gains?
Yeah, so time apportionment relief is essentially the HMRC allowing the policyholder to split the pre-UK residence with the UK residence period in terms of the gain. So, for instance, if Sophie lived in France for 5 years and the UK for 1, then only the 1 year would be attributed to and liable for UK taxation. The 5 years would essentially be under the French regime. So anything outside of UK residence, any gains that accrued when Sophie was not a UK resident will not be taxed here.
Okay, and the timing also through the tax year is important. Sophie's planning to move to UK in September. Should she consider triggering a chargeable event, either full or partial surrender, before she becomes tax resident? How do you navigate that calculation?
Yeah, that's a comparative exercise. So that's not a straight black and white yes or no answer. What Sophie would need to do is take a view with advice on what the French taxation will be if she crystallizes before she arrives, versus later down the line what her UK tax liability could potentially be, keeping in mind what I said before, which is that her salary, which I believe is substantial, will be the foundation, and then the gains on the bond will stack on top of that, essentially pushing her into probably the highest bracket if she's not already there. So it's a comparative exercise. It's not something that there's not a yes or no to that question.
And what kind of documentation does Sophie gather now, while still French resident, looking at evidence pre-UK gains and to preserve the time apportionment relief benefit?
Yeah, so recording all of her movements would be very important in terms of residence. So if she's going to rely on time apportionment relief, she should definitely have a record of her movements back and forth, especially since the UK is now on a residence basis for taxation. She should also have all of the bond providers' documentation. So, the full policy at the start, the contract, the history of surrenders, excess withdrawals, and also a valuation of the bond at the time she becomes UK resident.
And Gonzalo, if Sophie wants to adjust the investment strategy within the bond before moving to the UK, perhaps thinking about PPB compliance, can she do it without triggering chargeable event? What are the limitations around changing the investment strategy within the policy?
Yeah, surely. So it all depends on the product infrastructure. That's key. So as long as the product itself enables for different features and different investment modalities, it won't be a problem to shift between them as you go, as you relocate and change residency. So typically, if you move from countries that enable for, let's say, advisory managed accounts, which are not very compatible in the UK landscape, then when the person moves back to the UK, it is essential to recommend that person to select, for instance, a discretionary asset manager and make the necessary changes. As long as this is possible under the product, it won't have any tax effect at the level of the client. Everything happens within the offshore bond.
Okay, thank you. And Stacy, just looking at post-arrival, Sophie's become resident. How are gains taxed when she makes withdrawals from the bond? Gonzalo mentioned segmentation at the top. There's different concepts here. Walk us through some of the mechanics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So under the UK rules, Sophie will be allowed to withdraw 5% of the original premium, or of the premiums, if she's had an additional premium, per annum for a period of 20 years, and that's cumulative. So if in year 1 she does not withdraw her 5%, year 2 she can withdraw 10%, and so on and so forth. Anything in excess of the 5% is not considered tax deferred, so that would instantly trigger a chargeable event, which essentially will then have to go through the calculation to see if there's a gain. If there is a gain, then that goes on to Sophie's self-assessment tax return for that tax year.
So I guess one of the considerations is like buying a property, or what would from a bond of that size, the 5% is quite a lot to cover income needs. But perhaps if she wants to buy a substantial property after living in London, so what kind of considerations do people give?
Yes, so essentially, if the bond is segmented, which hopefully it is, then Sophie can do a full surrender of certain number of segments in order to put a deposit down on her London property and whatnot. And the reason why that's more favourable than doing an excess withdrawal is because the calculation is actually more favourable if you do a full surrender of mini policies rather than you go above the 5% in one whole policy. So that's why it's really imperative for UK resident policyholders to have their bonds segmented from day one. It just allows flexibility.
And top slicing relief is another phrase that people might, reading around this subject, might see. Why is that relevant? How would it apply here for Sophie?
Yeah, so top slicing relief essentially says, okay, you're at this tax band, you've made a withdrawal, or you've triggered a chargeable event that essentially pushes you into a higher tax band. In that circumstance, Sophie can say to HMRC, well, actually, I'd like to apply for top slicing relief, which essentially looks at the life of the bond and tries to kind of establish a rate, given Sophie's got like one tax rate at this point, but perhaps during the life of the bond, her band rate may have been lower. And then that would give her relief. Usually it results in a lower tax liability.
And what are Sophie's ongoing reporting obligations to HMRC? What does she disclose? How is the disclosure managed between the different counterparties she's working with?
Only when there's a gain.
Yeah.
So a chargeable event that results in a gain must be reported. There's no annual need to report the bond or to...
So that's something that would go through her tax return, and also the life company would make a report to
Yes.
HMRC. That's the way that the disclosure would happen.
Essentially what would happen is a gain would be triggered. The life company would issue a chargeable event certificate and give to the policyholder. Sophie will have that, and she will also be able to put the correct gain on her self-assessment return.
And Gonzalo, we touched on before about the investment considerations. Perhaps you could spell out, specific investment restrictions that apply to avoid PPB classification, because it's one of the major issues that people face.
Yes, so going a bit into specifics. So from the insurance perspective, we contemplate basically two scenarios, right? So one is collective investment schemes, funds. That's widely used, no problem. We make available that solution. And then if we go more into the private banking space, of course, we avoid and we restrict any type of assets which are personalized or limited to one investor or subset of group of investors. So these assets have to be collective and widely available for anyone to invest. And these could be included in a model portfolio with a regulated asset manager, with a standardized strategy, no personalized strategies, of course, so no intervention in the client, in the design of the strategy, in the design of on the selection of the assets, or any link between him and the management of that final investment. So that's clearly monitored from the insurance perspective, and normally the partners we work with are very well informed about this.
So if she likes picking stocks for her investments, she needs to have another vehicle or a separate pool of assets. This long-term pot needs to be managed on an arm's length basis to prevent issues.
That's fully correct. We have permanent questions about
Yeah.
people with a lot of financial expertise, but of course we inform them that if you want to preserve the tax efficiency of the vehicle, you should respect some strict rules.
And do you review with the wealth manager's performance? Kind of what's the obligation for the life company to look at how the money is managed, or how do you relate back to the client?
Yeah, so of course there is a pre-obligation, which is to ensure that of course the investment strategy that has been selected in the policy is respected, whether it's balanced, dynamic, moderate, whatever. That's the pre-filter. And of course during the life of the policy there is a check on the suitability of the investments, and of course there's some warnings when there's some high fluctuations or let's say substantial losses on portfolios. The asset manager is warned specifically, and corrective measures have to be taken. The insurance company, of course, is not, of course, the asset manager, but we have a fiduciary obligation towards the financial protection of the end client. So this is a fine line, but we need to be on top of it, of course.
Thank you. And Stacy, if Sophie's bond strays into the PPB and becomes classified as highly personalised, what are the consequences?
Yeah, the consequences are really harsh. So essentially, HMRC says, okay, just because you're holding personalised assets, we're going to tax you 50% on a deemed gain, so just a notional gain, on an annual basis. And that goes whether the investment has performed well whether Sophie has withdrawn any funds from it, it doesn't matter. They will just tax her anyway, 15% annually. The real risk is coming into the UK with a PPB, not realizing that until some years down the line, and then having to basically go through backdated, amended self-assessment tax returns, interest, penalties. HMRC are they will levy interest and penalties on backdated PPBs once discovered. So there's no real way to undo the damage. The damage essentially is it's most people caught in this situation where they believe they came in with an asset. It turns out to be a tax liability in the UK. We'll just have to surrender and restructure completely into a permitted policy, essentially.
So it's really about having the right team around the client, having the right legal advice coming into the UK, but also the right carrier who's going to be aware of these restrictions to prevent the client.
Yeah,
because remediating it doesn't sound like it's possible.
No, it's not possible. But also the client needs to flag that they're moving to the bond provider, to their tax advisors. And one of the mistakes that they make is that they don't tell us in time. And that's the real issue.
Okay. Well, if Sophie was coming in to see you next week, while she's still resident in France, she's got all this planning ahead of her. What are some of the things, the key takeaways from this conversation, Stacey, that you'd like to communicate with her? What are the most important things she should be thinking about as she makes the plan to move to the UK?
I would look at all of her assets that she's moving to the UK with. I would look at her employment role, her salary here, and then we would essentially look at the underlying investments. You know, we would look and make sure that they are permitted in the permitted class and that they will not fall foul of the PPB rules. And I would ask her to inform her bond provider that she is relocating. And then we will essentially look at whether it's structured in anything in particular that may not work in the UK, and advise her on time apportionment relief. Maybe top slicing may not be an issue for Sophie because it sounds like her income is going to be pretty high anyway, so she may not have a band to be pushed up to, but time apportionment relief will definitely be relevant for her.
Well, thank you. And Gonzalo, what would you, assuming that Sophie's already a One Life customer with this policy, what would your key bit of advice be to her or her advisors before she's making this move to the UK?
So I fully align with Stacey that the first mistake is not informing your broker, your insurance company, and your lawyer. So in most jurisdictions, and especially in the UK, if you do that late, it's already too late to check your policy and apply the amendments which are necessary for compliance. So this is the typical mistake, and do it with time. Don't do it on the day that you're moving. Do it 3 months before, because it's just the taxation, it's your inheritance, it's your will. So it's a lot of things to consider. So do it, and do it well in advance.
Well, thank you. Sound advice. And thank you for talking to me today, and we look forward to sharing this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.